Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a great illuminating program for you this evening. We're very pleased to be hosting Stu Eizenstat, who's here to talk about his new book, The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reach Historic Agreements that Change the World. Now, any book that has a laudatory blurb on the cover by Bill Clinton, a foreword by Henry Kissinger, and a preface by James Baker III. Now, any book like that should really be taken seriously. And Stu has certainly done a very serious and impressive job examining, as he does, some of the most important international agreements over the past half a century. Drawing on interviews with 150 senior diplomats and political leaders in the United States and abroad, Stu looks at what it took to reach major agreements or why some other talks failed, and what lessons can be learned for future negotiations. Stu himself, of course, has considerable experience in government and in some challenging negotiations. An attorney by profession, he leads the international practice at the DC law firm of Covington and Burling. But back during the Carter administration, Stu served as the president's chief domestic policy advisor. Later in the Clinton administration, he held a series of high-level positions at the Departments of Treasury, State, and Commerce, and also did a stint as U.S. ambassador to the European Union. During that period as well, Stu served as a special envoy on Holocaust-era issues, negotiating agreements with European governments on restitution of property and payment for slave and forced labor. He wrote about that effort in his first book, Imperfect Justice, which came out a little more than 20 years ago. And in his new book, he revisits the dealings that he had in the 1990s with Swiss, German, and Austrian authorities and commercial institutions to secure reparations and restitution for Holocaust survivors. In the years since, Stu's work on Holocaust matters has continued in his role as a special advisor in the Obama, Trump, and even still in the Biden administrations. Stu also has engaged in important talks on climate change. With only a few weeks of advance notice in late 1997, he became the lead U.S. negotiator for the Kyoto Protocols. That experience, too, is recounted in his new book, along with chapters on such other breakthrough agreements as the opening to China, German reunification, the Iran nuclear deal, various other Mideast Accords, Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement, and the Dayton Accords. More problematic, but also addressed, are U.S. efforts at peace and stability in Afghanistan and Iraq. So quite a range of diplomacy to learn from in this book, and Stu distills it all into 13 instructive lessons at the end. In conversation with Stu will be Laura Blumenfeld, a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, and previously a senior policy advisor on the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team. She also reported for the Washington Post for 20 years, covering the Middle East, national security, and presidential politics. And in 2001, she published a book, Revenge, about finding justice in a world of injury, drawing on her own hunt for the Palestinian who shot and wounded her father in a Jerusalem marketplace in 1986. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stuart Eizenstat and Laura Blumenfeld.
Thank you very much, Brad. I want to thank Politics and Prose for hosting this and Laura for moderating it. And with her credentials, I should be interviewing her rather than having her interview me. I also want to thank my research assistants, Ann Pence, Noah Weiner, Alex Mimont and Julia Nicolescu, who were invaluable in writing this. And I think that the first head of national intelligence and the Deputy Secretary of State, John Negroponte, and Diana are here as well, as is my loving partner, Marion Lewin, and so many friends and relatives, including my son Jay and daughter-in-law Jessica. At a turbulent time when the world is beset with conflicts that seem incapable of peaceful resolution, my goal in writing the book was threefold. I wanted to show how diplomacy could advance a solution to these problems and make our troubled world a better place. I also wanted to take a hard look at the role of military force in diplomacy in light of the many wars that have occurred in our recent lifetimes with mixed results, to learn lessons about whether, when, and how military force should be used as an adjunct to diplomacy. This is especially relevant today as we confront wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and Laura and I will be talking more about that. And last, I wanted to show the critical role of U.S. leadership in the success of some of the most important agreements in the last 50 years, to underscore the perils of looming isolationism, which would lead to an even more dangerous world where our adversaries with very different values and interests will fill the vacuum. I based my book on more than 130 interviews of American and foreign leaders who led these efforts, and I try to put the readers in the negotiating room with the key negotiators. Like an artist painting a photo or a painting or a picture, there is an art to diplomacy, framing negotiations so that the other side is convinced that it is in their interest to accept an agreement that is in America's interest. Diplomatic negotiations between countries are not a winner-take-all poker game. They have to be win-win situations on both sides or they don't work. Nor are they like commercial negotiations, which lead to one-off agreements that are enforceable in courts or by arbitration. There is no outside entity or authority to enforce international agreements. They depend on the trust of the parties who enter them. The diplomatic successes in my book start with the president selecting the right negotiator at the right time. This doesn't guarantee success, but without a highly skilled negotiator at the helm, failure is more certain. Diplomatic breakthroughs often owe their success to the talented men and women who lead these efforts and the qualities that they bring to the negotiations. It's difficult to imagine the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, German reunification within NATO without Jim Baker, the Good Friday Agreement on Northern Ireland without George Mitchell, the Camp David Accords without Jimmy Carter, the Dayton Accords ending the war in Bosnia without Richard Holbrooke, whose colleagues, by the way, described his style of negotiating as innovative jazz. Still, the idea of a heroic negotiator coming on horseback to save the day only works when the parties to the negotiations have a fundamental interest in reaching an accord. And that occurs where the pain of the status quo is often unbearable, as it was during the civil conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, played by the British with typical understatement as the Troubles, or where the benefits of an agreement are so great that they're worth the risk of making compromises to achieve, as Anwar Sadat of Egypt seeking the prospect of getting back the Sinai Peninsula from Israel and moving into a new alliance with the U.S. Negotiators take advantage of these imperatives if they're good. While each negotiation is different, the American negotiators who have forged successful agreements share a set of common skills. First, they have a fierce determination to grab the moment and succeed, to overcome all obstacles to success. Successful negotiators also have the political courage to put aside historic enmities to seize an opportunity from which others shy away, to take positions which might upset their political base. An example is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, who in 2020 was willing to take the risk to make an unpopular peace with Israel in the Abraham Accords. And it's the inability of current Israeli and Palestinian leaders to challenge their political bases that have doomed their negotiations over the past several decades. Negotiators must also have a high degree of intelligence, along with wisdom and sound judgment, and must always be prepared. As President Trump's international trade negotiator Robert Lighthizer put it, preparation, preparation, and preparation are crucial to success, to know more about the issues than anyone else at the table, so that you can see ways to bridge differences. Another attribute, and one that's very unappreciated, is the ability to listen to the other side, to understand what they need and whether it's compatible with U.S. interests. And in the process of listening, to pick up nuances of what they say and how they say it. How do they assert their positions? Is it just talking points, or is this going to be their bottom line? U.S. negotiators must be able to put themselves in the shoes of their opponent, to develop what former Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers, my boss at Treasury, called unsympathetic empathy for the other side's perspective. The ability to build trust is essential. Successful negotiators see their counterparts not as adversaries to be humbled and defeated, but as potential partners to help both sides achieve a result with which they can live. Building trust requires developing a personal relationship, regardless of how difficult that may be. For example, during negotiations over German reunification, Jim Baker developed a personal friendship with Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze of the Soviet Union by taking him on a several-day trip to his Jackson Hole, Wyoming ranch. And these are often necessary, but not sufficient if the interests of the parties diverge. An ailing Franklin Roosevelt, for example, thought his personal rapport with Stalin would be enough to make Yalta successful, without reckoning that Stalin's ultimate objective was to take over much of Eastern Europe after the Nazis were defeated. Another crucial factor is the use of back channels or informal so-called track 2 negotiations. These are especially important when the parties are unable to negotiate face-to-face because of mutual enmity. Kissinger went through Pakistan in 1971 to establish a back channel to convince China to sit down with him. The 1993 Oslo Accords between the Palestinian Authority and Israel was facilitated by back channel negotiations orchestrated by Yossi Beilin, an Israeli diplomat. Negotiations of the 2015 Iran Nuclear Agreement began by using the Sultan of Oman as a trusted intermediary, given the deep mutual distrust between the U.S. and Iran. Creativity is also critical in forging compromises to overcome seemingly insoluble problems. Ambassador Chet Crocker demonstrated great creativity in the Reagan administration in handling negotiations over the wars in southwestern Africa, developing a principle of linkage under which South Africa would withdraw from Namibia in return for Cuba withdrawing its troops from Angola. The ability to compromise without abandoning one's core principles is a necessary element in every successful international negotiation, including many in which I've partaken. This often requires using ambiguous language to overcome impasses that can be interpreted differently by each side. It's dangerous, yes, but the ambiguous language, for example, in the 1972 Shanghai Communique, used by Kissinger on the status of Taiwan, enabled the U.S. and China to end more than 2 decades of estrangement without crossing each other's red lines, even though each had a different understanding of the language on Taiwan. Every major agreement takes months, indeed sometimes years, to complete, and is akin to running a marathon with a sprint at the end. The talks always come down to highly intensive negotiations in the last days and hours, when clear thinking on little sleep is essential. And thus, negotiators to succeed must possess stamina, the stamina of a long-distance runner, the stamina of someone who runs the last mile in record time, to work around the clock under intense pressure, keeping a cool head. The term shuttle diplomacy was given to the round-the-clock negotiations that Kissinger conducted for 2 weeks following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, flying back and forth between Egypt, Syria, and Israel. Jimmy Carter averaged only a few hours of sleep during the 13 days and nights it took him to hammer out the Camp David Accords. Successful negotiators cannot be lone rangers. They have to have the full confidence of the president so that their counterparts know they're speaking for the president. And at the same time, they have to build, lead, and empower a team of experts to support them. However bright they are, however brilliant they have to have a team, even Kissinger and Baker. That is absolutely essential. Successful American negotiators must also skillfully employ leverage that comes with representing a superpower. That can be positive incentives. For example, facilitating the Egypt-Israel peace treaty came because of arms sales promised to Israel and crude oil guarantees, but also arms sales to Egypt. And the F-35 fighter jets given by the U.S. to the UAE facilitated the Abraham Accords that they reached with Israel. But there also can be negative incentives, negative pressures, from economic sanctions to threats of force or the actual use of military force. And let me conclude my introductory remarks by talking about military force. No decision an American president makes carries more weight than committing U.S. forces to war, with the attendant loss of life and the high economic and social costs. Wars always have unintended consequences, however well planned. Mistakes are made, including civilian deaths. Witness, for example, the mistaken bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo crisis in 1999, which they still remember and can't believe it was an accident. As the heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson put it, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. While military force was effective in producing a diplomatic solution to the Balkan wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, and in reversing Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War, our track record in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya, which, by the way, President Obama said was his single worst mistake, demonstrates that direct military action often fails to deliver the goals that American presidents have sought and indeed can make matters worse. These wars offer important lessons. First, there has to be a clear national interest and a well-conceived, attainable goal before you commit U.S. forces. Saddam Hussein's invasion of a sovereign Kuwait was a valid basis for the 1991 Gulf War. And there was a limited and achievable political goal, simply the withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. And indeed, Bush and Colin Powell were severely criticized for not going further into Baghdad when they had him on the run. And Colin Powell made the famous statement, "If we go into Baghdad, we'll own it." But under President Bush's son, he invaded Iraq to overthrow Saddam's regime, to seize purported weapons of mass destruction which didn't exist, and to create a Western-style democracy. It led former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates to conclude, and I quote, "We thought we could use the military to achieve political objectives that were probably unattainable." A second lesson on the use of force is the crucial importance of not going it alone, of seeking maximum multilateral support. Again, President H.W. Bush provided a textbook example of how to do that in the Gulf War after Saddam invaded Kuwait. But in Iraq War in 2003, more than 10 years later, President George W. Bush provided a textbook example of how not to wage war, forgetting the lessons of his own father. Third, when force is used, it has to be, as Colin Powell insisted, decisive. By the way, people always say he said overwhelming, and he said to me, no, I said decisive. One reason for the failure of our Afghan and Iraq wars was that George W. Bush and his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, prosecuted both wars simultaneously and on the cheap with a light footprint, dividing our forces, having inadequate force levels to achieve overly ambitious political goals. Fourth, before any military intervention, there have to be clear, shared understandings with the U.S. military of the political goals that can be realistically achieved and of the internal, cultural, historical, and political dynamics of the country being invaded. In the Iraq War, the Bush administration failed to appreciate the implications of deposing a Sunni dictator, Saddam Hussein, in a majority Shiite country. Even after force is committed, diplomats and economic development experts should not cede responsibility and control to military leaders of political goals. Diplomatic engagement and what is called soft power, that is, reconstruction projects, humanitarian assistance, the creation of sustainable governing structures, play a major role in consolidating political objectives following and sometimes simultaneous with military action. Unfortunately, we often get it backwards. It's crucial to plan a realistic political outcome before, and I say before, shooting the first bullet, not afterward, which was not done in Afghanistan, it was not done in Iraq, it was not done in Libya. We'll get into this, Laura, with Steve Hadley's quote on this, his the president's own national security advisor, of the lessons he learned from that. Finally, good intelligence is imperative. This was woefully lacking in the Iraq War when the CIA, Britain's MI6, and other Western intelligence agencies failed to recognize that Saddam was not hiding weapons of mass destruction. Senior members of the Bush administration admitted to me during my interviews that the key intelligence mistake was their failure to understand that Saddam had actually destroyed his WMD. Well, if that's the case, why was there a mystery about it? It was because even though he followed the UN mandate and destroyed it, he refused to admit this publicly for fear it would undermine and weaken him at home, within his own army, and embolden his domestic opponents, and it would embolden his archenemy Iran. This fundamental intelligence error cost thousands of lives, American and Iraqi, billions of dollars, and invaluable U.S. trust and credibility. In the end, outcomes of war determine the course of post-war negotiations. As Henry Kissinger noted, a country cannot achieve at the negotiating table what it has not won on the battlefield. Now, we'll get, Laura, in our discussions to how this applies to Gaza and Ukraine. But let me conclude by saying that if we Americans are to strengthen the art of diplomacy, and again, there is an art to diplomacy, to achieve our national interests, we have to nourish our democratic institutions at home, reduce our bitter internal polarization, and enhance our economic and military strength. Employing diplomacy in this way can help combat the disastrous isolationist sentiment I believe is gaining traction in our country, similar to what we experienced between the two world wars, which was arisen in part from a feeling that somehow we can't make the world a better place and that it's not worth the sacrifice to do so. This is a disastrous, disastrous feeling. I can think of no higher purpose for the U.S. than to leverage our own strength and influence through diplomacy to reduce conflict and take steps forward, even small ones, to address contentious issues that divide people and nations. And when I say small ones, if you go for a home run in a negotiation, you'll often strike out. Small steps are important. In, for example, the Good Friday Agreement, the most basic issue was never determined to this day, 2024, which is the status of Northern Ireland. The notion was if we can just get the parties to stop killing each other, we can build trust. It took 9 years after that to decommission the militias. So you have to go small ball sometimes and build trust on that. The alternative to engagement is a vacuum that will lead to an even more unstable and lawless world as our opponents with different values and different interests try to fill the void. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I want to start by saying happy pub date, right? Today is the birthday of your book, May 28th. And I see you have family here. I can tell you, when I was here last, I looked like you. I was about, yeah, a little bit pregnant and having birthed a book and a baby. I can tell you a book is harder. So you're good.
Well,
This
on the
is your-
pregnancy issue, this is my fourth book, and I'm not a woman, so I don't know the pain of childbirth. But I can tell you, to write a book takes a lot longer than 9 months, and I think it's got to be even more painful.
It is. It is. I tell you. Terrific. Well, as Jim Baker said, I think he described you. He said diplomatic skills are in your bones. So thank you for offering this kind of diplomatic CT scan of your book. It's fantastic. I highly recommend buy one and one for every member of your family. It appeals to every age. My son is a freshman studying international relations. We already have a copy for him. So really, bravo. I come from the newsroom of the Washington Post with Brad Graham. And before we started any story at the Washington Post, we always try to explain to the readers what are the stakes. So just to give you a sense of the stakes for the book that he's written for all of us really in the world, in your words, the challenges facing the U.S. abroad that require diplomatic negotiations. Okay, are you ready? Here are the stakes. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear threat from Iran and North Korea, Putin's war against Ukraine, rising China, civil war in Syria, Yemen, Africa with atrocities and destabilizing refugee flows, war between Israel and Hamas, and then at home we've got migration crisis on our southern border, and none of those problems can be solved by the U.S. alone. So again, this book is essential reading at a really important time for all of us. I guess I wanted to start just a little bit because it's remarkable what you did, the process of this book. You interviewed, as you said, 130 leaders, diplomats. I know that some of the characters of the book are actually sitting among us who've lived it. I see some writers, some columnists from the Washington Post and Newsweek who've written about it and critiqued it. Tell me a little bit about some of these interviews. You were one of the last people to interact with Henry Kissinger before he died, right? Anybody else who was surprising, interesting?
Yes, I was, Kissinger's foreword was written just a few months before he passed away, just before his 100th birthday. And I've said that if no one wants to read my book, they should at least read his foreword. It's quite remarkable.
It is.
Jim Baker was also in his late 80s when I interviewed him twice. I interviewed Iraqis, the Iraqi ambassador. I interviewed the former prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. I interviewed Tony Blair twice and Bertie Ahern. And this is an interesting story, actually, and it shows the issue of trust. So at a critical time in the Good Friday agreements, and remember, there was really a 100-year battle over the final status of Ireland, with Northern Ireland carved out. And you had a battle between the nationalists and the unionists that was incredibly bloody. So after very difficult negotiations that lasted for several years under George Mitchell's tutelage, they came to an agreement with one thing necessary, and that was the relationship that Northern Ireland and Ireland would have with the UK. And Blair and Bertie Ahern, both recently elected, had forged a remarkable friendship. And the last agreement that Blair signed off on, Ahern knew would not be acceptable to the pro-Irish group. And all of his aides said to him, for God's sake, don't tell Tony Blair. It's on him. And Ahern said, no, we have come this far, and I'm going to do something that may be against my immediate interest, but we in the long-term interest of forging an agreement. And he said to Tony, you made a mistake. This can never be accepted. And he had already submitted it. And George Mitchell took the blame and said, I made the mistake. George Mitchell, made the mistake. I should never have submitted this. And so they pulled it back and that got done. But it shows the element of trust that has to occur in these difficult negotiations.
I think that was it Kissinger who said trust is the currency for all.
Yes,
all
and
diplomatic-
interestingly, Kissinger said that trust is the currency, but it also has to be trust with the president. And he said to me, you know, people always talked about my relationship with Nixon, but the fact is, although at some levels it was difficult, he had trust in me and I had trust in him. And when I negotiated, people knew I was not negotiating for Henry Kissinger, I was negotiating for Richard Nixon. And when a negotiator doesn't have that relationship with his president, that doesn't work. But even with Jim Baker and Kissinger, they had a whole bevy of crucial people who negotiated elements of the agreement that they delegated. So that's why I say you can't just be a lone ranger no matter how brilliant you are. And with John Negroponte here, intelligence is so crucial. If you don't have the right intelligence, everything fails. So an example, with respect to the Shah of Iran and the whole Iranian crisis, with his leaving Iran under force, Khomeini coming in, this is remarkable. I think it's the worst, and I say this without qualification, the worst intelligence failure in modern American history and maybe in world history when you see of what we have to deal with Iran now. Carter was not told by the CIA, because they didn't know it, that the Shah had incurable cancer. They did not know that his support domestically rested on quicksand. And 6 weeks before he left, and I have this in writing, an actual memo that came to Brzezinski from the CIA, they said, Iran is not only not in a revolutionary state, it's not even in a pre-revolutionary state. So if you don't have good intelligence, you can't make good decisions.
And you also said in your sort of lessons of diplomacy how important it is to choose the right negotiator, because you said if you don't have good diplomacy, you can actually make things worse. And I think you talk about the example of the Treaty of Versailles, which concluded World War I and led to World War II, or at least lay the groundwork.
But another example, Laura, and I don't want to put the whole blame on him, because he's a very good public servant and very smart. But when Jerry Bremer was chosen as, in effect, our pro-counsel right after the Iraq War, and his first 2 orders were to dissolve the entire army of Saddam's on the ground that the entire army couldn't be trusted, when in fact it was only the top generals. And second, that anyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party, which was Saddam's party, could not get a government job. Now, I mean, this meant school teachers. So people went home from the army with their guns and no pay. And where did they go? They went to the militias. People who couldn't get jobs joined them. So this kind of mistake is absolutely deadly. And not having, again, someone who understood the country. And one of the problems we have in the Middle East is we don't understand the countries. We don't have the language capability. We don't have the understanding of their culture, of their history, of their politics. And no one thought before we invaded Iraq in 2003 to depose Saddam, forget the weapons of mass destruction fiasco, we didn't understand that he was a Sunni leader, a very small minority, in a majority Shiite country. Well, what happens when he's deposed? The Shiites have been suppressed, and they're not going to tolerate it.
You know, I appreciate failure in the Middle East. As Brad mentioned, I worked as an Israeli-Palestinian negotiator for the State Department under President Obama as a senior policy advisor. The talks collapsed in April of 2014, and I was on my way out the door one morning. I passed my 12-year-old daughter on the staircase, and she looked at me and she said, "Mommy, I think you made less peace." So that was her assessment, and that happens to too many of us in the Middle East. But I wanted to ask you today, actually, if you saw it in today's New York Times, just to switch newspapers for a minute, there was a profile of the potential future Secretary of State under potential President Trump. And it was Richard Grenell, if you've heard of him, Trump's diplomat in chief. I just want to read
Former ambassador to Germany.
exactly, and I wanted to read a quote from him about what he thought you would need in a Secretary of State, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are. He said, "If you want to avoid war, you better have a son of a bitch as the Secretary of State." Mr. Grinnell said, "America needs a tough chief diplomat who goes to the table and says, guys, if we don't solve this here, if we don't represent peace and figure out a tough way to get through this, I'm going to go back to the United States and transfer it to the Secretary of Defense, who doesn't negotiate. He's going to bomb you."
Well, good luck to all of us. That is certainly the opposite of what has to be done. You have to build trust and confidence. And yes, you do have, I mean, the American Eagle, which is on my book, by the way, holds olive branch and arrows. So we do have to have a military capability to undergird diplomacy, but not to lead with the military before. That's the great mistake that that Steve Hadley mentioned. And if I can just quote from the book, Steve Hadley was President George W. Bush's national security advisor. He was deeply involved in the Iraq War, the decision to invade and depose Saddam Hussein. And he said, reflecting on the Iraq War, that policymakers should start by asking, where do you want to end up? Then you work backward all the way to your initial military plan. You don't start with the military plan. If you cannot leave behind a stable situation consistent with your vital interests, then you shouldn't go to war.
So that is a common problem, right? That people flip it in the other direction. Another problem that I saw that you pointed out in diplomacy is that sometimes the negotiator can seem overly eager, and that was a problem that bedeviled Jimmy Carter with regard to the hostages, and then even Secretary Kerry with negotiating with the Iranians for the JCPOA nuclear agreement. Tell us about that, because that is a problem.
So I mentioned that one of the attributes is a fierce determination to succeed. But that determination has to go along with a willingness to walk away from a deal that doesn't work. So let me give you a personal example. For 5 days and nights, we negotiated the Kyoto climate change protocols with hundreds of countries. We finally come to the plenary session, which had run over a half a day already. We could hear the next exhibit. They were banging already the hammers to set it up. The air conditioning was off. The translators had left. And they went to each country, A to Z, and everybody said yes. They got to U for the United States, and I said no. And it caused a tremendous shock. I mean, here we are at what is supposed to be a celebratory signing ceremony, and the reason I said no is because the condition under which we accepted deep cuts in emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions, was that we would have emissions trading and other mechanisms to reduce the cost to our industry and to our country of those, and we didn't get them. The EU kept holding back and said, no, you have to start with regulatory measures at home. And we said, if we don't get them, no deal. So Raul Estrada, who was the COP chairman, former ambassador to Argentina, called us back into the green room, and we came up with an ambiguous language saying that domestic regulatory matters should be supplemented by market-based trading. Now, they could interpret that to mean it should only come afterward. We interpreted it to mean we could do it unlimited. So it was an ambiguous language, but it also was a recognition that you have to be willing, as determined as you are to reach an agreement, to walk away from one if it's not successful.
I think there's two interesting points there. You talked about how timing is so important, right? That sometimes when you've got that deadline, that puts the pressure on and you can get the deal. The other thing I thought was interesting about that example is you said that of all the multilateral negotiations you've been involved with or studied, The rawest, most intense, divisive of all subjects was climate change. The fact that that's the topic that gets people.
It was, and it was divisive for the following reasons. First of all, it took us weeks and weeks and weeks to develop an internal consensus. The economic agencies like Treasury, the Council of Economic Advisors, all were against taking deep cuts, while the environmental team wanted deeper cuts. So it took a very long time to get an internal consensus. Second, Vice President Gore came over the same day I came and gave us additional negotiating leverage. And that was very important. And his aides did not want him to come because they thought Kyoto was going to collapse and it would hurt his presidential campaign. And third, there's like a 13-hour time difference between the U.S. and Japan. And I was in constant contact at ridiculous hours of the day and night with Washington as each change was made. We also came up with something, and I talk about creativity. So let me give you two examples of creativity, very different. One example was in the Good Friday Agreement. As the negotiations are occurring, and George Mitchell is getting 13 different political parties together, the militias are continuing to operate, and people are getting killed on the street in the middle of the negotiations. So rather than stop them, he suspended the parties but kept them going. And then one party said to the other, you need to disarm. And he realized that neither was willing to do it together. So he came up with something he called the Mitchell Principles, which allowed them to keep their arms, but to agree that the solution would be a peaceful solution. And again, it was 9 years later before they did. What we did in Kyoto is we were getting bombarded by the European Union. We were alone. So we created something called the Umbrella Group, and we found like-minded countries that shared our opinion of having market-based mechanisms, and included, by the way, Russia, and New Zealand and Australia and others, and that gave us some weight against the EU.
There's one other interesting point. All 13 of these principles are fascinating. I wish we had time to drill down into all of them. But I thought the role of preparation, you have a chapter or a section called Prepare, 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 and how that made the difference between failure and success at Camp David, where Jimmy Carter did intensive research and prepared for the negotiations between Israel and Egypt, and Bill Clinton didn't for Camp David too. Can you tell us a little bit about how that made all the difference, preparation?
Yes, the preparation involves a number of things. First, you get a CIA profile of the negotiators that you're dealing with, so you know what their hot buttons are, their family, everything possible. And that was part of the preparation. He also knew every nuance of the agreement that had to be negotiated. He could do it himself. He drafted 20 separate peace agreements. He took them to build some trust, to Gettysburg, to the battlefield, to make the point that wars are enough. But here's where the preparation was crucial. 13 days and nights. The 13th day comes. This afternoon on Sunday, everyone agreed that that was the end. If we couldn't do it in 13 days, we had to leave. And this was catastrophic because Sadat had risked his life and of 2 foreign ministers who resigned to come to Jerusalem. If he came back empty-handed, he might be assassinated. So Carter, knowing the CIA profile on Begin, knew that he had 8 grandchildren and these were the apple of his eye. And so he got 8 pictures that had been taken at the very outset when the 3 of them were together at the very first day. And he got them autographed. He found out the names of each grandchild, autographed them personally, with best wishes for peace from Jimmy Carter, walked them over to Begin's cabin at Camp David, handed each one of them, and saw Begin read the names of each one of his grandchildren, saw his lips quiver and his eyes tear down, and he literally had said to Carter, I'm out of here. I cannot make any more compromises. I want you to get a car to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me back. And when he saw those photos and his eyes teared up, he put the bags down and he said, okay, I'll make one last chance. And he did.
Isn't that incredible?
There was also an interesting and funny anecdote that occurred 6 months later. People think Camp David was the end. It was not. It was only a framework. It was not a binding treaty. And it called in 3 months for a formal binding treaty between Egypt and Israel. Well, 6 months passed, no treaty. Carter, against the advice of literally everyone, went to the Middle East, spent 3.5 days negotiating between them in his own shuttle diplomacy. And then the last day, no agreement at all. Air Force One was refueled. The staff had all left, except 2 or 3 people. He's changing into relaxed clothes, and suddenly Begin calls and says, I'd like to see the president. Well, we were staying at the King David Hotel. And so when Carter learns about this, he says, please entertain Begin while I rechange and put a coat and tie on. And during that time, Begin says, you know, boys, this is a famous hotel, the King David Hotel. And we said, oh, yeah, we know that. Well, not for the reason you think. I blew it up when I was the head of the Irgun. But don't worry, I'm not going to do it while Carter's here. So he goes up into the presidential suite. They actually reach the final agreement. And then as they come down in the famous King David Hotel, the elevator sticks between the first floor and the lobby. And the Secret Service had to pull Begin and Carter out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
Fantastic. All right. Well, from there, let's go to Gaza. From there to the Israel-Hamas war, and tell us, with all the kind of wisdom and lessons that you've accumulated over the last 50 years, and what are we doing wrong? I mean, we're certainly trying. What are we doing wrong, and what can we do right? Because every day we're asked about the ceasefire, and we haven't been able to get there.
So let's deal with Gaza and then hopefully Ukraine. First, Hamas has to be disabled as a governing and military force. No sovereign country can accept a terrorist government on their border committed to their destruction. It's impossible. You can't live with that. We've tried back channels, one of the things I mentioned as a lesson, and the back channel using Qatar has worked for the first release of hostages, the first 100. But it's sort of run its course because I think Hamas feels it has the leverage and it's not going to do anything more unless it gets a permanent ceasefire, and Israel's not going to give it a permanent ceasefire. But the key thing is to recognize, and this is really crucial, that Hamas cannot be defeated by military means alone. There has to be a diplomatic part of the puzzle. And that's what the U.S. is trying to push. And let's put Gaza in context. I've been to Gaza, and I want to just tell you how things have changed. I was there in July of 2000 as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury because I was in charge of the economic dimension of the peace process. And what I saw was beautiful. We had something called qualifying industrial zones passed by Congress, still on the books, which allowed any company in an industrial zone in Egypt, in Jordan, or in the Palestinian Authority, which had peace agreements with Israel, to ship their products back duty-free to the United States if they had as little as 10% Israeli content. I saw 30 plants employing 1,200 Gazans. This is July of 2000, and we're not talking about a sort of another eon. They were building foundations for another 30 plants. I went into one of the plants, and I saw the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck with one unarmed Israeli soldier. Unarmed Israeli soldier. And then the Second Intifada came and everything changed. We often forget that in 2005, Sharon pulled all of the Israeli soldiers out, pulled 7,000 settlers out, left the infrastructure, greenhouses and everything, and Hamas destroyed it when they came in. So what I want to say is that Gaza is as tiny as Rhode Island, with over 2 million people, and we have to put Gaza in a broader context, and this is where diplomacy comes in. Israel cannot do it alone. It needs to see that this is part of a regional conflict. You've got Iran leading the so-called axis of resistance with Syria, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. We have the capability, which would be in Israel's supreme national security interest, of creating a counter coalition with Jordan, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and with the US to counter this axis. That is the greatest security. That, however, will only occur if there is some prospect of a future for the Palestinians. It does not mean an immediate Palestinian state, but it means some prospect that there will be some sovereignty at the end. Israel forgot the lessons in my book, and more importantly, the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. How? First, they thought you could domesticate that you could domesticate Hamas, and you couldn't. They weakened the Palestinian Authority, which for all of its corruptness is a much more moderate force in the West Bank, and they allowed Qatar to spend $500 million supporting Hamas. Tremendous failure of intelligence. Second, Dennis Ross and I co-chair a think tank called the Jewish People's Policy Institute in Jerusalem. And we've had briefings from generals who said the following to us, that under our own eyes, in just 2 years, Hamas transformed itself from being a terrorist organization, which would occasionally send individuals in to do mayhem, into a full-blown terrorist army, 30 to 40,000 strong, highly trained, highly armed, in tunnels as deep as 80 meters, without Israel knowing about it. The head of the Mossad, by the way, has resigned, effective at the end of the war. And last, what has to be understood is what General Petraeus did, and I interviewed him twice for the book, what he did to turn the Iraq War around. He called it clear, hold, and build. Clear the area of terrorists, hold that area so they don't come back, and then build simultaneously so civilians can see that you're separating the terrorists from them, that you're building a better life for them. That's not being done. That's absolutely critical. It has to be done, or you force the population into the hands of the terrorists. So this is absolutely crucial, and I hope that over time it will be done.
Fascinating. I want to, we have just a few more minutes, so I want to open it up to the, yes, and we're going to, hopefully those are questions about Ukraine. Is there a question about Ukraine? Because I would like to, favor a Ukrainian question. Go ahead and come up to the microphone and.
Okay. Do Ukraine, and then I want to ask a question about Gaza.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So on Ukraine, this is where Kissinger's admonition that the outcome at the negotiating table will be determined by what happens on the battlefield. And that's why it's so terribly important to do everything humanly possible to arm the Ukrainians so they can take back as much of their territory as possible. This is really crucial, and what has been so devastating is the 6-month delay in Congress appropriating money and then the administration not expediting getting Abrams tanks and F-16s done. This allowed the Russians to reinforce their defenses and really change the momentum. Second, there's going to be a territorial compromise. There has to be. I think that the two models are the 1953 Korean armistice and what happened in Cyprus in 1974. Neither involved an actual peace treaty. But For 70 years, we've had peace between North and South Korea. Not because there's a peace treaty, but because there is an armistice understanding. And I think that's what's going to have to happen here. We need to put Ukraine in the strongest bargaining position possible for those negotiations. But in the end, they're not going to get 100% of their land back. And we have to recognize that. But that doesn't mean that Putin gets a victory. They will remain an independent country. They will remain a Western country. They will ultimately, and I think sooner rather than later, be in the European Union. The goals that Putin set will not be there. And crucially, it's important that in any kind of an agreement, we do not end the sanctions against Russia. We have to keep them on as long as they hold Ukrainian territory. Next, we can't negotiate behind Zelensky's back. And here I'm critical of two things that happened. We negotiated the end of the Vietnam War, Kissinger himself, behind the back of the South Vietnamese government for whom we were fighting. We lost 58,000 men and women, but we ended up negotiating without their presence. In the Trump administration, and followed with Biden, we ended up negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan without the government of Afghanistan being present. And everybody said, well, look, the government collapsed. Well, they collapsed in part because we didn't leave any troops there, but also that they weren't involved in the negotiations. So when there are negotiations with Russia, it can't be behind Zelensky's back. He needs to make the decisions themselves. And one last thing. There's the old saying, fool me once, and it's on me. Fool me twice, it's on you. So in 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for an agreement that Russia signed to honor their territorial integrity, which they didn't. They then invaded Crimea. 2015, the so-called Minsk agreements. We signed the Minsk agreement, and it said, basically, when the fighting stops, we will protect your territorial integrity. And what did Putin say publicly? He said, it no longer exists. So we've been fooled twice. We can't, at the end of the day, allow a settlement in which we don't provide some substantial security guarantees to Ukraine, or Putin will repeat it again.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going
And
to.
so I'll switch my question, actually, now that we're talking about Ukraine. You mentioned North Korea and another settlement, armistice. How about Munich?
How about Munich? I mean, if you want a Munich II,
Peace in our time.
if you want a Munich II in our time, then you cut off funding for Ukraine. This would be a catastrophic mistake. It would be a moral blight on this country for as long as we are around as a country.
No,
it would be the repeat of Munich.
I'm not suggesting that we cut off.
No, but there are some who are suggesting that.
That's right. But the point is that was a settlement that was supposed to it was a diplomatic settlement. It's to avoid more conflict with a guy who cheated, Hitler. He wasn't interested in Czechoslovakia. He was interested in all of Europe, and he took it. And we can't force a settlement like that on Zelensky, because the same thing will happen.
I agree 100%. That's
Okay.
exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Now you can buy a book.
Whoever would like to ask a question, just come up to the microphone.
So I was just curious. Part of the talk was around the president having the trust of his or her advisors, and then also within, obviously the CIA and the diplomatic corps and whatnot. I'm just curious, what's your opinion on the rise of private intelligence being used by different presidents? Do you think this is a good thing, a bad thing? What's your overall analysis, just from someone who doesn't understand? Just curious.
Well, first of all, one of the things that Russia did is use so-called private troops without Russian, equipment and gear to go into the Donbass area, and then say, well, it's not us, it's just locals. So that's one thing. Second, you're talking about the black waters of the world, and oftentimes we use subcontractors to provide this, but when we have to rely on them for intelligence, then it's absolutely unacceptable. So sometimes you need them for supplementing security, but you can never substitute for the intelligence we get. And by the way, on the intelligence, we got it right. Bill Burns is such a gift to the country. We got it right. We told Zelensky that the Russians were going to invade. February of 2022, and they dismissed it. The intelligence in Israel on Gaza, actually Israel had the whole blueprint with the hand gliders, with the disabling of the communications towers, several days before the invasion. And the Israeli intelligence, as it got up the chain, said, there's no way Hamas has the capability of doing this. But you can't supplement your government intelligence for private intelligence. It just doesn't work. And they have economic interests at heart as well.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this insightful, powerful discussion, and so timely. We have to, I think we have to end here, but I just want to quote from Nancy Sutterberg. Do we have time for one more? Okay, yes, go ahead.
What can you tell us about the WHO pandemic treaty negotiations?
The WHO, the
Yeah.
World Health Organization.
Yeah, so you mean for Gaza or more generally on pandemics?
Well, they're past several deadlines, I think.
Yes.
They have a conference coming up, and
Yes, I think it'll end up getting done, and this is a good example of where we share interests with countries like China, who also have concerns there. I do want to mention just one very funny incident which we talked about, and this involved Rob Portman,
Yes.
who was the head of trade negotiations under the George W. Bush administration.
This is about the importance of personal connections with.
The importance of personal connections. So he was negotiating a trade agreement, and the holdout was the Japanese on agriculture, not allowing more American agricultural goods in. And their farmers are just really virulent. I mean, they literally set themselves on fire over agricultural issues. So he was looking for a way of getting to the agricultural minister on a personal level. And he told the Japanese counterpart that, he just mentioned indirectly, really, that it was his wife's birthday. Well, the translator mistranslated it into the fact that they were on their honeymoon together. And the trade minister for Japan said, Mr. Representative, I'm going to give you a wedding present. I'm going to finally agree to your demand. And Portman said to himself, do I tell him the truth? And he said, I still think I did the right decision by not telling him the truth.
Terrific, thank you.